Hi, this is Dr. P to talk about the stages at which a tabletop game design might be abandoned, and this applies to some extent for video games as well, but there's a somewhat different dynamic going on there. And the reason I'm going to talk about this is to help inexperienced designers, to help them understand their experiences, because even the best designers abandon some of their designs. Now, abandon may mean only temporarily for months or even years, but often it means permanently in the end. So I have games, including one game that's been published, that I didn't do anything with for about 3 years, but it's now been published. In other words, in most cases, the game usually deserves to be abandoned. If you think of your game as, quote, my baby, unquote, which you shouldn't, then you might not abandon it when you ought to. There are lots of games on Kickstarter and on GameCrafter that should have been abandoned but weren't. In other words, they're not very good games, but they get self-published, or they convince other people to spend money to support the self-publishing. I recommend that you work on many games so you won't get overfond about any one of them, and you'll be more willing to abandon it when it's necessary. So why does this happen? Well, again, take the example of Alan R. Moon, designer of Ticket to Ride, among other games, winner of the German Game of the Year award twice. He said 60% of his designs would never be published. Now, I don't know what he meant about designs, whether he meant finished ones, ones that he'd got to a particular stage, but that's what he said. And in my experience, many of the game designs that I start, including many that get to a prototype stage and are played, will never be published because I've abandoned them. Now, there is the idea of letting a game lie fallow, kind of like a farmer lets his field lie fallow so it can improve and do better the next year. And I find that I often do this because of the way I design games. I have a game, a space war game that only uses 110 cards that lay fallow for 4 years, but I've revived it and publishers are considering it now. My game Sea Kings, which was published in 2015, lay fallow for a few years. I can talk about race games, an Axis and Allies reboot, a Kingmaker remake, all lying fallow without getting to the point of playing a prototype. Epic Britannia, 3rd edition Britannia, has lain fallow for 2 years, and I've played that many, many times, and yet now it's just sitting there, and hopefully it'll end up better for it. And I have a couple of games, one of which has been accepted by a publisher, that lay fallow for somewhere between 25 and 30 years. So here are the stages that I'm going to discuss. I'll discuss each one. So I'm not going to repeat these. I'll just begin. One stage is you get an idea or the germ of an idea, and you record it in some way. Write it down, voice record, whatever it is. But you discover that there's nothing behind it, nothing you can think of anyway. So it just sort of sits there, and it may never be used. This happens a lot because ideas alone aren't worth much, and most game ideas aren't very good, but it is quick. Or a game title, which is similar. You get an idea for a title, the title sounds good, but you can't think of a viable game for it. Depending on how good you are with titles, this may only happen occasionally or it may happen a lot. I have a separate category in my computer database for titles without games. I'm not that good at titles, but I'm not bad either, and so every once in a while I think of one and say, that's a good title, but rarely do I end up coming up with a game for it. Another stage, which is almost as common as getting an idea and then not getting anywhere with it, is you make notes about something. Could be pages of notes or just a few, but somehow it doesn't excite you and it doesn't work in the end. Things don't fit. Or perhaps there's a problem you can't solve, so you let it lie, and you may never come back to it, or a few years from now you may come to it and suddenly come up with modifications that result in a playable game. That happened to me just recently. Another stage where you might abandon the game is when you start making a prototype because there's some problem you can't solve, or you don't like the solution enough to continue with the prototype. The problem could be physical on a tabletop, it could be programming in a video game, it could be some impractical thing that sounded good on paper but doesn't work in practice. Sometimes you can overcome these. The question is whether you want to bother. And it may be that you just can't figure out a way to overcome it even if you work at it. Another stage is when you play the prototype solo, which of course most designers do. Obviously in video games you play solo, but in tabletop games you should play solo so that you can find out the worst problems and straighten them out before you inflict the game on other people. But you may play it solo and you feel there's nothing in it, or it doesn't meet your standards, or perhaps most likely it isn't much like what you had in mind and you don't particularly like it. The next stage is when other people play your prototype. Maybe it just doesn't work well enough, and either you can't fix it or you don't feel it's worth fixing. I suspect that novice designers rarely stop here because it's my baby and they don't want to kill it. Another stage is you may have playtested the game repeatedly and not been able to overcome what you see as its flaws. This happens. There may be a flaw that's so much a part of the game that there's no way to get rid of it without essentially starting a new game. Or you just can't figure out a solution to the flaws, although somebody else might. Or you can have repeated playtesting and you decide, even though the game is essentially complete, that it's just not good enough. And again, many novice designers won't recognize that, and such games may turn up on Kickstarter or GameCrafter. You can have a game that you think you've finished but you don't market it. That may be because the game is not very marketable. Abstract games, for example, are hard to market because people buy games for the story even when the story has little to do with the game. Also, market tastes change. You may finish a game that would have been good on the market a few years ago, but not now. And maybe it'll be good on the market a few years hence. So even a game that you've finished but not marketed, you may come back to and market years later. Then there's the possibility that you submit the game to a publisher but can't find one who wants to take it, which is not unusual. Persistence pays off. Keep that in mind. There are well-known games that were rejected many times. But some games might be cursed with bad luck, bad timing, and many others just may not be good enough. Do remember though, rejection is often a product of the publisher's objectives or the current state of their product line or their schedule or changes in the market or other factors that are completely out of your control. So you could submit a game, have it rejected by many publishers, put it aside, and years later submit that same game again and tastes have changed and it may be picked up immediately. You just don't know. I'll give you a simple example here. I submitted my game, which became Britannia, to Avalon Hill. And they said, games of this era don't sell. So I submitted it to H.P. Gibson's in England, and they picked it up and 2 years later published it. And the next year Avalon Hill published it. They had seen that games of that era did sell. And also there was a certain advantage there because the plates had been made to produce the game in Britain, and those same plates were used to produce the game in the United States, so it was cheaper for Avalon Hill to produce. Then for self-publishing, which is what many people prefer to do these days, you might have a Kickstarter or other funding failure. Crowdfunding is specialized. It attracts visually oriented people and shiny people. Some games just aren't as likely to succeed as others via crowdfunding, although they'll do just as well in the overall game market. For the crowdfunded game, you need something that's cool, that's shiny, that's chromy. Of course, many Kickstarters also fail because of poorly planned or executed campaigns. Also keep in mind, Kickstarter is not about the game, it's about the product. Recently I saw a game that has been successfully kickstarted and is not even close to being finished. Essentially, people have supported an idea. Keep in mind, a game can be abandoned at any of these stages and then successfully resurrected years later. But many, if not most, deserve to be abandoned. Thanks for listening.